What up, people? I've been playing RPGs for a really long time now, and it's easily my favorite genre when it comes to video games. Memorable characters, exploration, and all the many customizations available are only some of the very few things that make these type of games so special and addicting. But if you or someone else was trying to get into RPGs for the very first time, where would you start? Because I want as many people to enjoy these games as possible, I've compiled a list of RPGs perfectly suited for people who've never played one before. Now, some of these games are for RPG beginners, but also specific type of gamers I had in my head with some of these. It'll make sense when we get to those specific games. Also, if you're new to the channel, I make videos of single player games with a heavy focus on RPGs, as you can tell. If that's something that interests you and you end up enjoying this video, consider subscribing or just hitting the like button to help with the algorithm. And with that, here are 10 RPGs that are perfect for beginners. Let's start the list off with something recent, Visions of Mana. This action JRPG was released in late August of this year and was developed by Square Enix. The main reason this game is such a great place to start for someone wanting to get into RPGs is the combat. You'll be fighting with 3 members of your party and you can easily switch between them at any time during the fight. Like most RPGs, most of the fighting will involve doing combos using the light and strong buttons. And while you are able to switch classes that switches up the combos you have, the ones I've seen so far are still very simple. There are 2 kinds of damage, physical and elemental. Physical is split between slash and strike, and elemental is divided into fire, water, wind, earth, darkness, light, moon, and wood. While you're fighting, you'll have access to a ring system that lets players have a shortcut to spells, items, and abilities without having to pause and do all that stuff. One of my favorite parts of the combat was the class strikes, which are these super moves that you can use to turn the tide in the fight. In order to use these moves, you'll have to fill up your CS gauge, which you can do by successfully attacking an enemy or countering their attacks. I'm not sure if dodging attacks increases the gauge, but I don't think it does. And not only is this a good entry point for RPGs, but it's also good for the Mana series as well. There's no story events tying any of the Mana games together, so there's no reason you can't just jump into this latest entry. Now, when it comes to JRPGs or RPGs, a lot of them, even the good ones, tend to run a little long, and for newcomers to the genre, that could be a little bit of a turnoff. Thankfully, it seems like Visions of Mana will only take about 25 to 40 hours depending on how much of the side content you want to do, so that's good. So while Visions of Mana is in no way the best game on this list, I can make a strong argument that it's still the best one to start with. Next on the list we have Super Mario RPG. If you don't know much about the game, it was released last year and is a modern remake of the 1996 game Super Mario RPG Legend of the 7 Stars. The combat uses a traditional turn-based system with active time elements or speed contributing extra attacks. One of the more innovative features of the combat was the inclusion of time button press sequences, which later became a mainstay of all Mario RPGs. This will be a good entry point for RPGs because even if you never played a video game before, you already know who Mario is. Most of us have played a Mario game at some point in our life, and having an RPG with characters you're familiar with, like Mario, Peach, and Bowser, is a much easier selling point in my opinion. The turn-based combat is also fairly simple, and even the time hit mechanic isn't too hard to pick up once you get used to it. Plus, the game is fairly short with the average playtime around 10 hours or so not much of a commitment for newcomers. So if you or someone you know has a Nintendo Switch and you're interested in getting into RPGs, Super Mario RPG is the perfect place to start. Let's stick with Nintendo for a little bit longer with the next game on our list, Pokemon Sword and Shield. While this is a good game for anyone trying to get into RPGs, I specifically picked this one for kids trying to get into the genre. With Pokemon, kids will have a beginner-friendly version of managing a party of up to 6 party members, which will be their Pokemon. Common RPG mechanics like dealing with movesets, type advantages, item management, and party synergy are all things they'll be dealing with and getting comfortable while just looking for cool and cute Pokemon to catch. I've been a huge Pokemon fan since I was a kid, getting Pokemon Red on my hand-me-down Game Boy, and I was hooked immediately. That sense of adventure and exploration that the game provides, even at such a small scale, definitely shaped what interests me in RPGs today. Now, the reason I chose Sword and Shield over Scarlet and Violet is that Sword and Shield is much more linear. While I think Scarlet and Violet are overall better games, I feel the more linear progression of Sword and Shield is better suited for first-time players than an open world. Personally, the simplicity of Sword and Shield turned me off of it, but I'm a grown man, so these games might be preferable to a child. Now, don't get me wrong, it's Pokemon, so either series will be fine to start with, but if you're trying to get your kid or maybe a niece or nephew comfortable with RPGs, consider Pokemon Sword and Shield. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077. Similar to how I recommend Pokemon for kids getting into RPGs, I recommend Cyberpunk for people who are used to playing a lot of shooters like Call of Duty, Halo, and Gears of War. While there are obviously better RPGs to play, I felt Cyberpunk would be a good way to get an FPS fan used to RPG elements and mechanics. Compared to other shooters, I personally think the guns feel good to use, but not right away. Some of the guns I got earlier on weren't that great, but once I started getting rarer guns that fit my personal playstyle, which are assault rifles and snipers, gameplay was much more enjoyable. Speaking of playstyle, the skill trees for the games have been completely overhauled, and now it's even easier to spend your points in the categories you care about, like vehicles, assault rifles, pistols, or health and melee. And while I didn't spend a lot of time doing melee combat, being able to use katana swords close range to whittle away damage and then being able to switch to a shotgun to finish the job instantly is beyond satisfying. Also, with this game being made by the same people who made Witcher 3, I was sure the story and side quests would be of high quality, and thankfully I was proven right. The story is good, but some of the side content in Cyberpunk are really fun and were easily the highlight of the game for me. Now, addressing the elephant in the room, saying this game was released with a lot of issues would be the understatement of the millennium. But after a bunch of patches and updates, specifically the major 2.0 update, Cyberpunk is finally a great game that's worth recommending. So if you haven't checked in on the game since launch, it's gotten a lot better. Like I said, there are much better RPGs out there for people trying to get into the genre, but if you're trying to convince someone who plays shooters to try RPGs, Cyberpunk 2077 is the perfect choice. Just outside the top 5 we have Fire Emblem Engage. This strategy RPG is an exclusive to the Nintendo Switch and was released in January of just last year. Strategy RPGs can be overwhelming with all the things you have to manage, and Fire Emblem is no different. Leveling up units, unit skills, item and weapon management, and balancing out your squad is a lot to deal with. Luckily, Fire Emblem Engage is pretty linear in its story progression, and managing your units, especially on lower difficulties, is pretty easy. If you play on normal difficulty, you don't have to worry about which units are the strongest, you can just pick who you think is cool. And as far as item and weapon management, you can just go to a unit and hit what's called optimized items, and the game will pick the best weapons and items for that character depending on their specific class and weapon grades. That small little feature will be such a lifesaver for someone just starting out with strategy RPGs and just wants to play and not worry about any of that stuff. Another reason Engage is a good starting point for strategy RPGs is that the game went back to the weapon triangle mechanic. Unlike in Fire Emblem Three Houses, which is another great game, the weapon triangle returns with the popular rock paper scissors format of swords over axes, axes over lances, and lances over swords. There is a new mechanic that involves the introduction of fist weapons, which have the advantage over magic bows and daggers, but other than that, it's pretty similar to the 3DS games. While Three Houses gave you much more freedom in combat, the weapon triangle will be much easier to remember and take advantage of. Like I said, strategy RPGs can be very overwhelming even for veteran RPG fans, let alone newbies. But I think Fire Emblem Engage's combination of linear chapter progression with a simplified management system makes this a solid jumping off point. Starting off the top 5, we have Disco Elysium. Disco Elysium is an isometric RPG originally released in October of 2019, with the final cut being a free definitive update that includes new clothes, characters, words, and the biggest thing being the game now being fully voice acted. Because this game is very story and dialogue focused, I picked this RPG for people who are avid book readers or big fans of podcasts and audiobooks. This will also be good for someone who hasn't played many games in general either and can get their feet wet with an RPG with no combat. Disco Elysium takes place in the seaside district of the fictional city of Elysium that's recovering from a siege which occurred decades prior to the game's start. You'll be taking on the role of an amnesiac detective who has been tasked with solving a murder mystery. During the investigation, he comes to recall events about his own past as well as current forces trying to affect the city. The gameplay features no combat in the traditional sense like I mentioned earlier. Instead, it is handled through skill checks and dialogue trees. There are 4 primary abilities in the game: intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics. The thing I enjoyed the most about this game is how many layers get peeled the more you explore the district and just talk to people. Most of the characters are interesting to learn about, and a lot of them feel like actual people you talk to in your own day-to-day lives. And not only were the characters interesting, the main and side quests related to them were even better because of them. There were so many times that I met a character early on that was related to a quest I would get 2 or 3 hours later, or I would randomly discover an item that unlocked a secret mission or dialogue choice from the characters who helped I needed with something. Exploring and finding unique ways to tackle issues is really satisfying and easily the biggest highlight of this game. If you're a newcomer to RPGs and you're someone who tends to value well-written characters and immersive storytelling, there's no better place to start than Disco Elysium. At number 4, we have a weird one for this list, and that's Divinity Original Sin 2. Just like Disco Elysium, this is an isometric RPG, but it's focused more on turn-based combat and tactics. In combat, each character takes turns to attack with action points limiting the type of quantity or attacks that can be utilized. Moving reduces action points based on distance travel, and attacking skills reduce action points based on usage requirements. Depending on the type of attack, it will damage either magical or physical armor of the target. My personal favorite part of the combat is how the environment can be a huge advantage or disadvantage if you're not careful. Using arrows or magic from a higher position will be more damaging. Creating steam can cause visibility issues. Characters on fire will lose damage over time, and poison can hurt or heal depending on the character. Similar to Fire Emblem Engage, there's a lot of stuff to manage involving items, weapons, and what moves to put in the shortcut slot. On top of that, there's a lot more strategy that comes with this game involving positioning of your characters to get an advantage during a fight. But if you're an RPG newbie, you don't have to worry about any of that because you're going to be playing on story or explorer mode. These 2 modes make combat a lot easier to handle and learn while you can just focus on exploration, talking to characters, or completing quests. A lot of people who've never played a CRPG before tried these modes, and it helped them get used to the mechanics while not being terrified of fighting. And when you do get comfortable with the combat, or you find it becoming a little too easy, you can bump the difficulty back up to normal at any time. CRPGs are some of the hardest games to learn and understand, but these easier difficulties of Definitive Original Sin 2 will not only make it easier to play, but in the case of RPG newcomers, probably more fun as well. At number 3 we have Dragon Quest XI. Honestly, I don't have much to say about this one. When it comes to being beginner friendly, this JRPG is about as simple as it gets. When it comes to turn-based combat, character customization, and exploration, it's all pretty straightforward. Now, that's not to imply this is a mediocre game, it's far from it. This game has a high level of quality that's hard not to notice. The gameplay is fantastic, the music is amazing, and the cast of characters you'll be playing as do just enough to not feel too much like one-dimensional tropes. The only glaring issue with this game when it comes to recommending it is the playtime. This game is long. Like really long. For someone new to the genre or specifically JRPGs, unfortunately this is something you're going to have to get used to quickly, but it can still be intimidating to jump into and may turn some people away. But if you or someone else looking to get into RPGs are okay with the game with such a large investment attached to it, I think Dragon Quest XI is worth all the time you're inevitably going to put into it. Sticking with turn-based, just missing out on the top spot is Persona 5 Royal. Gameplay involves going through dungeons or palaces as you fight and recruit personas, solve puzzles, and ultimately defeat the boss of each palace. When you're not doing that, you'll be spending time in the real world where you'll spend your time going to school, studying, working, or just enjoying the fun things to do in the city. You'll also be spending time with confidants, which will give you rewards and perks that will benefit you when you go back into the dungeons. Not only is this game pretty linear as far as going through dungeons and fighting personas, the quality of life improvements added in the Royal Edition make it even better for JRPG newbies to jump into. The only thing I can see being a little overwhelming is dividing up your time between dungeon crawling and what confidants to hang out with during your free time and not running out of time for the dungeon. The original Persona 5 was my very first Persona game, and I was worried about all that stuff initially, but the game is very good about helping you remember important tasks to do. While in the real world, the other members will constantly remind you of the last day you can complete the dungeon, so it'll almost be impossible to forget. And if you start worrying about which confidants to hang out with, I recommend either just spending time with whoever has the perks you prefer, or whoever storyline seems the most interesting. That's kind of what I did. Hardcore and veteran fans of the Persona series follow a strict guide usually to make sure they tackle everything the game has to offer, but for first-time players of Persona 5 Royal, I highly recommend you just take your time, relax, and enjoy this extremely stylish turn-based JRPG. Because there's so many amazing RPGs to start with for beginners, here's a list of honorable mentions that just didn't make the cut. And finally, at number 1, we have Final Fantasy VII Remake. For those who don't know, this game is the first in a planned 3-game trilogy remaking the iconic Final Fantasy VII released back in 1997. I know some of you are probably wondering why I'm recommending this and not the game it's based off of. Well, in my opinion, I feel like it will be easier to get someone into a genre or just games in general if you start with something a little more modern with a little flashiness to boot. And Final Fantasy VII Remake definitely covers all of that. The combat system in the game showcases a hybrid style many have compared to Final Fantasy 15 or Kingdom Hearts, which is also a good place to start. You can either fight in real time or fight in what's called tactical mode, where time slows down and allows you to choose your next move without being punished. Integrated into that is a new version of the active time battle or ATB system. This time around, the ATB meter fills up slowly by itself, but you can fill up faster by connecting on attacks. Once it is filled, the player can halt the action and use special abilities such as magic, items, and special moves. While the combat can get somewhat complex if you start obsessing over team synergy, which characters get what materia, or that convoluted weapon skill system, thankfully you can get the game to do some of that stuff for you if you don't feel like dealing with it initially. The story in FF7 Remake is also amazing as well. It does a really good job of being faithful to the original story while also putting its own spin on it without feeling out of place. While the gameplay is obviously what's the most important, I think a game having a great story to keep a newcomer engaged and immersed is really beneficial. Funny enough, with how good the combat, story, and music is in the game, if this is the first RPG you ever play, it might actually spoil you when it comes to playing other games afterwards. But be that as it may, while perhaps not the best RPG for beginners, it's 100% one of the best RPGs available to play. Now, I'm really interested in what you guys think. Are you looking to get into RPGs? Are you trying to get someone else into them? Which games would you recommend? Let me know in the comments. If you want more RPG content from me, click one of the links on the screen. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with the channel. Later.